Hello, everyone. We're here with Stephanie Hare. Hi, Stephanie. It's nice to meet you and chat with you a little bit. Um, we're here mainly to talk about Stephanie's book, Technology is Not Neutral, and I got an opportunity to read through the book, and there's some very interesting topics here, very germane to the age in which we live. And some of the arguments that you make, I think, will be very relevant for not only philosophers, but for technologists and anyone who really uses technology, which today is a good portion of the population around the world. So very relevant book and interesting topics. We're going to cover a number of areas hopefully in this conversation, but I want to start out really focusing on your book and some of the introductory ideas, mainly because I want to make sure that everybody understands what you mean by certain terms. Obviously, in the book, technology is not neutral. There's a lot of terms just in the title that we want to make sure we understand. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we get into the interview. But I want to start out with that term neutral, because it is a fascinating term. We're going to talk a little bit about tools as well, because you say, you make the argument technology can be seen as a tool, and a tool can tend to be neutral or not neutral. So I want to make sure that we understand as we get into this conversation what you mean by neutrality, and particularly in the context of technology, and then we can kind of see how that ties into different tools that technology brings to the table and how they're used.
Sure, with pleasure. So on this question of definitions, I didn't want to just focus on digital, which is so tempting because that tends to be the things that I work on the most, and that I think a lot of us kind of understand the ethical questions about technology from a digital perspective. So what does it mean to behave online, social media or misinformation and disinformation, and how that's affecting society in terms of, body image for children or mental health or the integrity of elections. So we all kind of get that. And we also know like, oh, I might be addicted to my smartphones. We can understand there's an addiction and a mental health component even to smartphones. And that's why there's a smartphone on the cover, because I wanted to come up with a tool that was like instantly recognizable to all humans if they looked just at the picture. But I wanted to also really broaden out in the text of the book and be like, this is about so much more than just data sets or algorithms or like code writ large. And I didn't just want to focus on like the big tech companies from the United States. I wanted to really just almost go, back to basics, back to first principles, and be like, animals use tools. It's not just humans. So let's just take it right back to like living creatures on this planet. Some of them have come up with uses for tools, which are obviously not digital, although it'd be terrifying and kind of amazing to find the birds have an entire network going on, or dolphins. But a lot of animals have tools, and like therefore that kind of elemental concept of what it means for a living creature to find something in nature and use it for a purpose, and then to fashion it, to adapt it. So eventually, how do you get to become Homo sapiens, who can put things up in outer space or talk as you and I are over a distance of thousands of miles and an 8-hour time difference? And we just take this for granted now. But you and I in our lifetime would have found this a miracle, and now we're just like, yeah, fine. So that idea of tools as things that we fashion that can be found objects in nature, and quite simple, like a bone that was being used in 2001: A Space Odyssey by one of our ancestors, a hominin. And I love it. I don't know if you've watched the film recently, but I had to watch it while writing this book because I had a moment of insomnia. And that's when I decided to weave it in, is I watched how you could see he sort of picks up this bone and he's just looking at it. And it's like such a slow scene. I think it's like 20 minutes of him just, and then you see him smashing the hell out of the carcass where he found the bone, where he's like, oh, I could use this to destroy something. And then it cuts, and he's clearly, I don't know, I'm using he, it could be a she. This creature has clearly demonstrated the concept to his or her friends in the troop. And they use it as a defensive weapon. But of course, it could be used to something else, and they defend their watering hole. And I was like, oh, we humans, like, we instantly will take tools and turn them into weapons. Like all you have to do is watch little kids playing. And once they get beyond the like eating things stage, they very quickly start using it to pound stuff or bash you on the head, bash themselves on the head. There's something about us, we seem to come out of the box that way, which is really interesting. But we also use it to make music or to make art, so it's something about, I really wanted to step away from the digital first and take us right back to 40,000 years ago. People were transmitting information using tools in really interesting ways. What is it about us as a species that makes us do that? And then we can start talking about things like the atomic bomb. Then we can start talking about things like the internet or smartphones or, wherever you want to go. But I wanted to set that base to be like, you don't have to be working in technology or to be a philosopher or to even think you have an interest in this stuff. This is your birthright. Like, if you're a human being on this planet, this is as much part of your birthright as art or music is.
So that's a really fascinating point. So a tool, I want to go back to the concept of neutrality, right? So bone is neutral until it's put to some use, which is a tool, right? So a bone can be used to bash someone over the head, or it can be used to hammer something into a piece of wood, right? So when we talk about the ethics and neutrality, ethics is about intention, right? What do you intend to accomplish? And we're going to go back to this concept of ethics as value as well, because I think that's also very important. But let's go back to the title, right? So technology is not neutral. So technology could be seen as a tool in the way you just described, right? And you're saying that in and of itself, it's not neutral, regardless of the intention, or maybe not regardless of the intention. So what's embedded in that title if you take technology as a tool in the way that you just described, and then how do you apply the lack of neutrality to it?
Sure. So the reason I wanted to play with this a little bit was because I was always hearing from people, and believed it myself for quite a long time, I must confess, that technology is neutral and that it's how we humans use it that makes it good or bad. So that's like a school of thought that I kind of playfully set up in the first chapter, where it's like, there's a debate. Let's just imagine two teams, and team one is technology is neutral. It's how we humans use it that makes it good or bad. And then there's team two, which is like, absolutely not. Technology is not neutral, and here's why, like from the outset. And I think it comes down to, if you can, that phrase, no matter how thin you slice it, it's still bologna, is coming up. Like, imagine that you have the best intellectual scalpel in the world. And so you can like very finely cut an idea process to be like, at what point does it go from being neutral to not? So like, if I'm just sitting here with an idea in my head for a really great tool or technology, because you could also define a technology as a process, right? It doesn't have to just be an object. It could be like a way of manufacturing cars, or the assembly line is a great example of that. How do you disseminate knowledge and skills is like a technology. So you can think of it quite broadly again. So when does it go from being like the found object of like the bone? So an animal finds a bone, or a human ancestor finds a bone, and the bone is just there in nature and you don't have to do anything to it. And then at that point, you can either use it as a tool to like stir a pot and do some cooking, or murder someone in your tribe. Good versus bad, or benign versus, evil. Versus you find that bone, or you find that other found object, and you adapt it in some way. So now you aren't just taking a found object, you're making something. And the minute I think that you have to start making those, effectively design choices, which is really interesting, because some animals actually do fashion tools. It isn't just that they pick it up and start, smashing something with it or using it to find food. They will actually fashion a tool, which implies a design choice is being made. And that, again, we're back to the scalpel of like very refined ketting here. Once those values are being embedded in the tool or in the process of like, this is the way we do something, unless it's done in this way, it is not that. That's where I think the neutrality question becomes into play, because it's like, why did you choose to do it this way and not that? And why does this animal use it this way and not that? Or why does this group of humans in time use it in this way and not that? So just right there in the design phase, before you've even started using it, to be like, oh, it's how we use it that makes it good or bad. It's like, you could literally just be like messing around in your house, which is where so many people start their first innovations.
Mhm.
And as you're crafting it and designing it and prototyping it, it being a tool or a tech, you're putting values into it. So instantly, when we go back to humans, we'll leave our animal friends away for the moment. Instantly, you have to be like, okay, well, who's the person doing that? You know, is it a man or is it a woman? Is it an old person or is it a young person? Is it a child? Is it somebody who has children or who doesn't? So they're thinking about health and safety things for kids in a different way. That whole thing of like, and then you have to get funding for it. So like, who's going to fund it? Well, that matters. Like, again, like who's funding a lot of our tools and technology today is pretty dodgy in some examples.
Sure.
Really, really ethically fraught. And you don't always have transparency around that. So if you're a designer or an engineer, or frankly, just a customer who just wants to, you know, have a phone and get on with their life, you're like, do I need to care that this was funded by investors who come from an authoritarian regime that like chop off people's heads or treat women as like people with absolutely zero rights, or who lock up like millions of Uyghur Muslims in the west of China? Like, do I care about that? Do I care if the United States and China are even involved in a tech war? If I'm from Belgium, I just want a phone, right? So like those questions at each moment, from idea all the way through to who designs it, who makes the data sets, the software, the hardware, the sourcing thereof. So where you get the raw materials is not a neutral question. And rare earths is a great example of that, because so many of our rare earths, unfortunately, are coming right now from countries where, again, it's very politically fraught. There's also the environmental consequences of getting them out of the ground. Again, not neutral, like who suffers from that. It's a big mess if you look at it through that lens, which is obviously the lens I was looking through it in the book. So from end to end, from idea to execution, and that beautiful moment that David Bowie describes so well in The Gray Area. And he cites, obviously, you know, Marcel Duchamp and others, where he's like, the process isn't complete. Like, it isn't linear, it's a circle. Because the process isn't complete until that tool or technology is out there and other people are using it, and then you get that feedback of how are they using it, and that's when you get into intended and unintended consequences.
That's good. So I'm gonna try to rephrase, just because I want to make sure I understand. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you can totally tell me that I'm off base. But the way that I, like, as a technologist, the way that I think about technology when you use it in the title and in the first part of your book is a piece of hardware. Let's say I'm looking at a laptop right now talking to you, and to me the laptop's neutral, right? I can use it to do bad things. I could use it to steal from people and watch porn or whatever, right? Or I could use it to have a really good philosophical conversation with you. The technology itself is not neutral, or is neutral. So when I think of this piece of hardware, that's what I think of as technology. What I hear you saying is the modern technological environment kind of is not neutral, right? The way that the laptop might be built, and the intention of the person or people that built the laptop, and the way the laptop parts are sourced, and the way that it's put into use, that entire environment is not neutral. And when you use the term technology is not neutral, what it sounds like to me is that you're saying that environment and the whole process, not the piece of hardware that might be produced, right? So I'm thinking of another example. Online payments were started to help people buy porn, right? That's how the early PayPals of the world came into being. And that technology had a very specific, and we might say nefarious purpose. It was then leveraged later for, we might say, a good purpose, to democratize like payments and to make, give access to more money to more people, right? That's what a lot of like fintech companies are promising, right? So it started out with we might say, a bad purpose, and then turned into a good purpose as a technology, right? But the technology itself, the intention was maybe not something that a lot of people would like, but it turned into something decent, right? So I'm trying to get to that kind of that core idea of, you don't seem to be claiming that the piece of hardware isn't neutral, but the environment, the whole context is what is neutral.
But even then, like, is the piece of hardware not neutral? So like, I'm talking to you on a MacBook Air. What are you talking to me on?
MacBook Pro.
Right. So right there, we need to talk about, how are these devices made? Like, literally, what is in them? Who are they made by? Apple. Is Apple neutral? Does Apple have a neutral track record on labor, on its supply chain, on its political lobbying, on, you know, staffing issues within, right? Like we, you know, we could just, and that's not an anti-Apple statement. It's more just to become like aware that like this iPhone, which is talking, you know, with my device as well, this iPhone allowed me to have access to an app here in the United Kingdom that is called the NHS app that would allow me to do contact tracing, but also show my vaccine passport when traveling, and for a brief period of time when it was required by law, in a blink, here in the actual country itself, all of which was very politically fraught, right? So like, there's also just the fact that lots of people don't have that phone or the other phones that were allowed to support that technology, which meant they were not able to have a digital record of their vaccine status or benefit from contact tracing technology that was being tried in this country. So you have some people benefiting from a process and a technology and others not, yet we were all taxpayers paying into that. It's just that only some people benefited from the result, right? Now that's not Apple's fault. That's just like a reality of tech, which is like tech is not democratic. Not everyone can afford an iPhone. Not everyone can afford a smartphone, or some people are just terrified of them. Like there's a whole digital divide of the elderly, or, you know, the digitally excluded that we have to just be aware of contextually. So I would challenge, like, I reckon we could come up with together, you and I, or like any engineer who like would want to, like, let's take off the keyboard, look within the computer and like source every single component in this laptop and in your device and be like, oh, where did that come from? What's the environmental footprint of that? Is Apple paying enough tax? Like, why are we supporting a country that's tax efficient, not tax dodging, but which is keeping a lot of its money parked offshore, right? Like, that's what I guess I mean. And Kate Crawford talks about this beautifully in her book, The Atlas of AI, which I would recommend if you haven't read, or if anyone watching this hasn't read, to do. It's wonderfully accessible. And she really opened my mind to this kind of way of thinking, to be like, you know, it's terrible because like it's like having augmented reality, but within your own brain. Once you learn this kind of thinking, you see it everywhere, and you're like, oh God, not a single object in this house, on my person, spending choice that I'm making, eating choice that I'm making, none of it is neutral. It is all having consequences and relationships, and is the result of values and choices that we make about those values.
Yeah, it's a good call out. It actually brings something. I want to pivot a little bit on this. Maybe we can get a little bit practical for a moment and then get back to the theoretical. So what you say, I think, is a very common sentiment, right? That we can't just go through the world with blinders on and just assume everything's going to be okay. I know for myself, I get very fatigued by all the things I need to care about these days, right? Like if I have to think about every single decision, what I put into my body, what devices I use, what components are in the devices that I use, what did the company do 10 years ago that has an impact in the device that I use, what clothes am I wearing, where are the clothes stored? Like if you start to list everything in a day that we have to care about, I think we would first of all be completely paralyzed, but we'd be exhausted. Like people are just tired. They're tired of having to care about so much. So given what you just said, do you have a practical way to navigate that? So technology is not neutral. We need to give a shit. We need to care. How do we navigate all the things we're being told by every corner of society that we need to give attention to without either completely paralyzing us or like causing us not to get out of bed in the morning because we're gonna do harm, right?
Yeah.
Do you have a practical way to navigate that?
Okay, saying this with like full disclosure that there is no like halo and wings on me. Like I am not angelic in any means, and I'm very, very human and live a deeply ethically flawed, compromised life, as I feel like we probably all are doing. So just that massive caveat
Yeah.
said, I feel like what I have found as a good sanity-inducing tip is like not to let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think if you can be 5% or 10% more mindful about some of your choices,
Yeah.
that's still worth doing. Like, I don't like this binary thinking that, again, I think in the digital world, zeros and ones, black and white, all or nothing. That's not very helpful. And it's not very human. I like more of the fact that you're on a journey. So like, of course, but why not? We are on a journey. We're going throughout our lives. So maybe, maybe you're going to decide it's like with health and fitness, you know, you don't just suddenly eat like a god. You know, my body is a temple and like have the athletic fitness regime of an Olympic athlete. What you might do is be like, I'm going to cut out booze and cigarettes, you know, and maybe I'm gonna try and eat more vegetables. So you pick like a goal and you just start with that. Or like maybe you start with breakfast. You're like, my diet is atrocious. I need to overhaul it. I want to get fit and healthy. But everybody knows if you try and do it all at once, it's too much and then people end up quitting and it's very frustrating for them. So usually what you say is like something small and achievable, like let's just get you eating either eggs or porridge / oatmeal for breakfast, and then we're going to improve your lunch, and then we're going to improve your dinner. And like by the time you're done, and it will take 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, you're going to see, you know, you can actually measure that in your blood. Your cholesterol will improve and you will be sleeping better at night because you're not putting all this shit into your body, right? Ditto with running. You don't just start running a marathon or a half marathon. You do like a couch to 5K, then you do a 10K, then you might do a half marathon. This is a project of months, if not years, for many people. You might want to add in some weightlifting so you don't injure yourself and like strengthen your core, throw in a yoga class. You don't do that on like a Tuesday when you wake up and you're like, right, you know, now I'm going to do this. Like it's sort of like a very gradual evolution. So I reckon we could probably apply this to our technological lives. So you might be like, what kind of social media am I on? And like, what are my privacy settings? And am I exposing any family or friends or like colleagues and political activist stuff that I might be doing to any risk? Unfortunately, we have to think about this now. So like locking down your privacy settings and like improving your cybersecurity with multi-factor authentication, educating your kids or your parents about it if they're of a certain age. I don't mean to be ageist. I'm just saying to have these family conversations. That might be a really good start. If you're a teacher, you can have a massive impact on the children in your lives, but also learn from them because they'll be mentoring you about how tech is also being used to your horror. It might be, you know, do you decide to stay in the Apple ecosystem as you and I have, or do you want to do something else? Right. So like, I don't want to sort of push or judge, but it could be investing. Like you could literally go and talk to your pension planner and be like, I want to only be investing in ethical funds or green climate funds, or, you know, I'm just throwing that out there. You could be very active on pressuring Apple if you want to keep using them to be like, what are you doing to pressure China on its human rights record? And Apple might be like, nothing, because we don't want to, or maybe they will. Pushing your senators and elected representatives in Congress on privacy protections, or saying, I don't want facial recognition in my kid's school. So like, I kind of think it doesn't matter what you do as long as you pick something and go for it. Like just eat your spinach for a while and then maybe add. Once you've got the spinach down, add tomatoes, right? So pick your little like personal life and then your local life, and maybe then you can go bigger. Like nobody can do everything because it would be exhausting. And it's like really important to remember. I'm reading War and Peace at the moment, and like Leo Tolstoy by the end of his life is just like checked out. He's totally pissed off, and like, you know, his life ends in a really quite intense way from where it starts. And it did make me think that, where it's like, sometimes overthinking things might end in stranger places. But then he inspired Gandhi and helped end the British Empire. So, you know, maybe that was all meant to be. I'm just saying that like, that letting perfect be the enemy of the good thing, that way madness lies. I reckon little achievable goals is still worthwhile. Just do what you can.
Yeah, that's a principle that James Clear's Atomic Habits really emphasizes. Obviously, that's his whole approach. But as I read through your book, like if any of us tried to care about everything that you talk about in that book, it would be insurmountable in a lot of ways and exhausting. So just trying to practically, how do we navigate? You read through the book, you kind of get a little worried, you start, looking for problems around every corner, and it can be paralyzing. So what you just recommended, I think, is very, very helpful, because you have to chew off a little bit at a time, and you can expand that over time, right? And like you said, it might take years. You're going to add to it, but as you master one small area, then you might add something else and continue to grow from there.
Or you might just be really happy with being like, I'm just going to focus on my kids, right? So I'm just going to focus on like keeping my kids safe online, making sure that their school isn't doing like crazy surveillance ed tech stuff on them, not taking their biometrics, and like making sure I'm just aware of how my kids are online and their friends, and being like a good parent. That might be enough.
Sure.
Great. Yep. If you want to go more though, and be like, I want to, some people enjoy arguing on the internet, I'm told. You might want to get involved on pressuring on certain issues, awesome. Or if you're like, I'm actually just doing it with my consumer choices, like I only buy with these people and I don't do that and I feel no need to take that further. I just think whatever you do, I don't view it as paralyzing. I almost feel more where I'm like, you can't but succeed, because all you have to do is literally just pick something and you're probably going to make it that tiny bit better and then just iterate over the course of your life. See where you go.
Yeah, that's good guidance, I think. All right, let's get back to some of the concepts in the book. I'm going to read a quote here because it caught my attention. You're talking about how technology is used and how it can be overused. And now we kind of have this, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but almost like this mob mentality where people can gang up on Twitter and go after somebody or whatever. And you use the phrase, we've seen the powerful and mighty brought down by the swarm of Twitter and Reddit. One person on Twitter may be powerless, thousands are very powerful. Was that, I think that was out of your book, or it was a theme kind of in your book. And I think the idea there is that, like, when you get a bunch of people on a platform, whether it be Facebook or another platform, that mob, that group can actually have a lot of influence. And if I recall correctly, in the book, you were saying that could be definitely a negative, right? Because you can have one person, like you were using the example of President Trump and how he was using social media platforms to mobilize a bunch of people to do bad things, right? So one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I had this conversation with another colleague in technology, is this whole idea of symmetry in technology. So just as some nefarious person can use technology to mobilize a crowd to do something negative, a lot of us have access to technology to counteract that. So there's a symmetry in the way that technology can be used. Now, if you have like a government that is using secret technology that the rest of us don't have access to, there's an asymmetry there, right? So now the government or corporation is more powerful than the people that might want to try to fight it, right? But we see these kind of symmetries a lot where a Twitter storm comes out and it goes after somebody, and then there's a counter Twitter storm, and they try to like balance each other out and neutralize each other. So I want to just put that in front of you and see what your take is on that, particularly in this context of how technology is used is really important from an ethical perspective, and whether you see that largely right now it's largely asymmetrical in the way that technology is used, or do you still think we're in a state where those symmetries exist and that they can be balanced out?
Ooh, well, I think from all the research that I've read, and I'm using Twitter mainly as my example here, but I think it's probably true as well elsewhere, the experience of women and people of color on these platforms is very different to people who do not fit that description, in the sense that they are harassed and receive far more abuse. And I don't know if I would say, I don't want to criticize colleagues who I know are working very hard on this problem. I think I would say that we're still not there yet in terms of, is there a good reporting mechanism? There's also just a weird education piece of, I think people do things online that they would never do in person, that they would never say in person. There's something about the way that the technology itself works that seems to incentivize, anger and outrage and that mob mentality. And we haven't been very good at thinking of like, how do we have fire breakers in to stop it? So I'm thinking even with WhatsApp, with the misinformation and disinformation problem, it was because it could be shared so widely, and they had to sort of make it where you can only send messages to, I think, a maximum of like 150 people, thinking that would somehow solve the problem. I don't necessarily think that has. So I think in that sense, no, I don't think we've done a very good job at addressing the asymmetry at all. And I also think, even the question of being like validated on Twitter to get like a blue tick mark, who is deciding that? And if you don't get validated, what does that even mean? It's just such a weird concept to be like, this person is deemed to be an authority of knowledge or a public person, and this person isn't. And also, what responsibilities come with that little blue tick as well? Because like, they aren't all journalists or like think tank fact checking, upstanding people. Like, some of them are total nut jobs who are also pumping stuff out, but they've got a blue tick, I guess, so that you can know that they are in fact pumping this stuff out. That it really is coming from your president, as opposed to a bot or a scam account. So No, I don't think we're there at all on that. And it's really worrying. It's particularly worrying again for younger users. Like children, I think have to be the most vulnerable constituency that we would think of in this case. But it worries me a lot for women and people of color because the consequences of sexism and misogyny can lead to, rape and death threats. And ditto for people of color who are having to deal with neo-Nazis or anti-Semites or whatever, where, this can translate very quickly into the physical world, right, of actual threats. And the police are not, I think, up to date enough and skilled enough and talking to the public about how we're here to support you. I don't think anybody feels particularly supported by their police department, probably in any country in the world, on that. And I say that with all love and respect to our officers in blue. It's still so fresh and new comparatively, and they're so stretched and under-resourced against so many other threats. A bunch of people saying mean things about you or doxing you probably doesn't feel as real to them as like the other 8,000 things on their to-do list. So I think we've got a long way to go to fix that asymmetry, I guess, is my bottom line.
Right. So where do you think that asymmetry is coming from? Is it an access problem? And I don't want to call out a specific platform, but you think the platform creators are biasing the platform against certain people groups? Like, you would say, like, if in terms of access, I would say most people have access to a specific social media platform and can post whatever they want, particularly if you hide kind of who you are, right? Like you can kind of hide who you are, right? So the platform itself provides that symmetry, but you're arguing that there are people groups that are targeted and don't feel like they have the same power. And what's the basis of that asymmetry in your perspective?
I think our society, right? So like again, like Kate Crawford said that in her talk to the Royal Society a few years ago. She's like, do you think the world is neutral? Like, take a look around. Is it neutral? When you and I are both in the United States, like that's a country with a massive problem of race because of our history of slavery and the way that we've dealt with that. We also have a serious sexism, misogyny issue, right? Which is like playing out right now in real time about things like the fundamental right to control your own body and your reproduction system versus like the power of the state to deny you that right. So, tech is not like some sort of utopia. It's just reflecting all of this stuff. So you get like a self-selecting group. The Financial Times, for instance, here in the UK where I live, put out a sort of kind of request being like, why are all of the people who write letters to the editor to this newspaper, why are they all men? And I just, as a woman, I was like, because like no woman has the time. They're like, every woman I know is like busting her ass, just like getting it done. Like she's working, she's raising kids, she's in a relationship, she's got all of her hobbies, she's involved with her community. She's not going to be taking time out of her busy life to write for the Financial Times to like have a go or contribute her thoughts about monetary policy, as discussed by Gillian Tett or something. It's just not going to happen. Whereas for some reason men do. And like we know that because we can see like all the wonderful studies that have been done about who has more free time, and like men have way more free time than women. So like maybe they just have more time. But also, if you live in a society that has never encouraged women to like think in public, and also when women do think in public, they do get absolutely smacked down. Like, why would you sign up for an emotional beating? Like, you'll just go do something else. So, more like emotionally healthy and worthwhile with your life. So I think it's those things that are already existing in the so-called analog world just get amplified and distorted. And again, like if outrage is what's incentivized and trafficked on these sites, it's a self-selecting group of people who are like, you know what, I'm really unhappy with my life, so I'm going to go online to any platform that we care to discuss and like share that. Or the kind of people who really want to, just stir shit up with misinformation and disinformation. That's a self-selecting group. So they want to do that. Tools and technologies exist for them. Whereas like other people might not want to do that. And when they are on that tool or technology because they're just like wanting to look at recipes, or follow the news or something, they are then seeing this and they might leave or they might just not engage. So there's a massive silent constituency, I suspect, of quite normal, healthy people out there that we just never hear from because that's just not something that they're going to do. They're not going to be like, let me give some thoughts on social media, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's very what we see on social media, I don't think is very representative of reality in terms of I wouldn't want to take it as a proxy, but I also think it's a weird like funhouse mirror that kind of reflects some weird version of reality as well.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point where the technology reflects the asymmetries in society, but there's also a deeper level where you might argue that the technology itself is biased. So there might be an asymmetry in access or an asymmetry in the way that, people are able to use it. So for example, I think it's definitely true that governments and large corporations have more power using technology than the people that it's delivered to, right? Because they have access to the data and they have access to, secret APIs or whatever you want to, say there, right? Because they develop that technology and they use it. So there's an asymmetry there. So in order to make that symmetrical, the people that are actually using the technology have to use it in various ways that it wasn't intended to use, right? That's an asymmetry with the technology itself versus reflecting the asymmetry in society, right? So there's two kind of dynamics happening there, and there's probably a half a dozen others that creates the environment that you describe in the book pretty profoundly. And particularly when you're talking about keeping people safe, right? Children or whatever, that asymmetry is really important to understand and try to figure out how you're going to deal with it. Really interesting.
For people to understand that these are platforms that are run by private companies who are incentivized, it's not a public square. It's a money making machine, and their duty is to their shareholders. End of. Like, I sometimes get quite frustrated with this idea that like, oh, it's this like utopian space of freedom of expression, etc. It's like, have you been to the United States? Like, have you talked to Wall Street? Have you talked to these technologists? It is about making money and power, right? So, and power being an expression of values, an instrumentalization of values, means we have to go back to ethics. So that's why I started with like ethics first, but built out with the other 5 branches of philosophy within the book, just to give people other tools to play with. It's like, know who you are dealing with. Elon Musk is not like doing any of this out of the kindness of his heart. Ditto Mark Zuckerberg, ditto Jeff Bezos, like none of them, right? And like, there's a really interesting argument that you could make of like, do we need a more like public utility approach to social media? Could you create a public version of a social media platform, but then you'd have all the people going, oh my God, you don't want the government anywhere near that, because then it's the state and it's censorship. Again, living here in the UK, you should hear how polarizing the BBC is for a lot of people here. So for some people think it's fantastic. Other people are constantly criticizing it. All of this suggests to me it's probably doing a good job if it's managed to irritate that many people for and against. And bias and disclosure, I do a lot of work with them and think that they're fantastic, but by no means perfect, because what is? But I'm just saying, I live in a country where the government has a very powerful role with a state-funded, publicly funded broadcaster that has a function here within this country of 4 devolved governments, and a soft power function of being a world service broadcasting situation that is pumping out British values around the world. And that goes back to the history of empire. So again, none of this is neutral, right? It is really, really loaded with values. And you need to know that and be engaged with that and understand what you're doing so that you wield that power as responsibly as possible. I know the US has like, NPR and Voice of America as well doing similar functions, but I don't think they're as dominant in the psyche of Americans or abroad as much as the BBC is. So, what do you do? What's the answer? Do you like leave it in the handful of like a bunch of oligarchs, basically, like tech oligarchs? Or do you go for a more publicly funded approach? But what does that look like so that you're not doing, Russia Today? So it's tricky.
Yeah. And it is hard. I actually had a question written I sent you earlier where I was asking about technology like newspaper or the printing press, right? Hundreds of years ago, people got their information. People were largely illiterate. They got their information from a source, largely the church. And the church told you what to believe. The church told you what was happening in the world. The church told you this and that, right? And then you had conversation with people, but you couldn't get your information from any other source. Then you had the printing press that came in, a technology that changed everything, right? Now you can print newspapers, and maybe the sources changed. So instead of getting your information from the church, you got it from a local editor. And that was your source of truth because there was one paper in your town or whatever. Now the internet's changed all that, right? Where you can get sources of information from everywhere, and you can get all types of points of view, and you can get the conversation. The conversation can happen in many different ways, and you can talk about it in a myriad of platforms, right? So what's better? Is it that top down? This is the right way to think about problems. This is where truth comes from. Is it better to have it all out there and then the individual has to kind of figure out how to navigate the situation, or is there a blend, right? And then it comes down to that, like that authoritarian version of truth versus there's a lot of different truths and I got to figure out the path that I want to take. And I had sent you a question about that, and you kind of touched on that a little bit. And I think about that a lot philosophically, and it's extremely challenging to know which direction to go there, right? Because we talk about fake news and disinformation all the time, but that's what the internet provides. It provides all voices, an opportunity for all voices. And I don't know if it's right to squash those voices and replace it with some kind of an authoritarian approach, right? So it's, what's your perspective on that?
So my dream in life would be for newspapers or other sources of information. So it's not just newspapers, it would be so much bigger, but I'm just talking about the media has a special responsibility here to report on track records. Because I feel like, again, the media has like an attention span of a gnatfly, unless you're looking at your investigative journalists who I think are doing God's work. And there are people that really follow stories sometimes for years and bring it out, but those are really expensive to fund. Those journalists be super committed, and they can often face like real danger doing that reporting. Other people that are doing stuff that's much more ephemeral. And, they'll report on something and they'll, this has happened. And then you're like, whatever happened to that thing that was like reported? If you were to pick up now, fun experiment, go back and look at any major like sources of media for even like 6 to 12 months ago and like look at what people were thinking and talking about then. And you'll see all sorts of pundits and blowhards particularly, but also just like normal scientists and, economists making their predictions. We never get a follow through to be like, what, is this person, like, how would you rate them? 9 times out of 10, do they get it right? Or are they just like wrong all the time, but they keep getting platformed? So it would be like being able to rate, I don't know, sovereign debt or stocks, right? Like, I want to know what the performance is of these people. And we know this in science because we're able to, thanks to the scientific method, do peer review. So, if you want to put a drug out onto the market, it has to go through such rigorous testing and all sorts of critique, before it's finally allowed out. And even then, this doesn't just stop. It's iterative. It's constantly being tested and validated and probed and improved upon. We don't seem to do that as much in like the social sciences, liberal arts, humanities. It can get to a point where it's like, everybody has an opinion. And like, I think we've almost overcorrected to be like, nobody wants to say that anyone's right or wrong, oftentimes out of wanting to be like respectful and understanding plurality, or just thinking I just want a quiet life and I don't want to get doxxed, on Twitter and get nailed. Or like a sense of humility that I think happened for a lot of people in the US and the UK after 2016, which is like, I really did think that these political outcomes, e.g. the election in the US, the Brexit vote here, I really thought they were going to go this way. And in fact, they went the opposite. So perhaps I don't know my own country or the political data or the economic data or people's decision-making processes as well as I thought I did. So I think some of that comes from a good place of being like, I don't want to have an opinion on the pandemic because I'm, hopefully not opining on something that I'm not an epidemiologist, virologist, or immunologist for. Like, what the hell do I know about what people should be doing? We need experts. But I live in a country where, again, we have a very powerful minister here, Michael Gove, who said after the Brexit vote, the British people have had enough of experts, which I thought was hilarious because during the pandemic, all I wanted was experts. I was not interested in like the person on the street's view on this. That said, the person on the street's view on this actually informed an app called the Zoe app that reported symptoms and started to track the pathology of the disease far faster than what the government was doing with its public health initiatives. So I've just contradicted myself there beautifully to be like, maybe you do want to crowdsource your
the complexity of the problem, right? There isn't a single solution that's gonna solve this. I like where you're going with this, your dream solution, because it does put the responsibility on the part of the individual, but there's a social component to it. So, I'm going to put a little plug in here for philosophy. We need a lot more critical thinking in terms of our educational system, so people know how to suss through data, and they can weight arguments, and they can sniff out fallacies, right? That is really important from just a public education perspective, and I think philosophy is fantastic for helping people with that. But there is that social element too, where you need the data to suss out, right? If you don't have it, if you're getting one source or just a small handful of sources, or you've kind of turned off all the news you disagree with or whatever, you're not going to be able to sniff out the fallacies on either side, right? Because it's all one source. So I think that
I have like the expertise to know whose track record is what on everything. What I want again would be like the same way that I could decide to make investment decisions. I want like a performance over time of this person writing in the FT or Bloomberg or on Fox News and being like, oh, this person, what is their batting average? We do this for sports. We do it for baseball. Why can't we do it for, economists and political pundits and the like, intellectuals, if you will, so that I know, this person gets it pretty right most of the time. They got a good track record on deciding Putin and what he's going to do, versus somebody who just says any old thing and like is routinely proven to be wrong. I will choose to spend my time differently if I know. And it's not that we can't do that. It's just I think it's a much more laborious process. And there's an absolute tower of books behind me that is like part of my effort to try to learn more about the world, to do my own macro track records for certain people on certain topics. But I would love if somebody could actually, formalize this with the media, because it would just make everybody's life, I think, a lot easier.
I have a tool that would help.
Yeah.
100%.
New business idea. Go. Someone build it.
Go. We're getting close on time. We had an interesting conversation before we started recording about your own philosophical development, vis-a-vis your time in the United States versus France and the UK. I wanted to see if you could just give us a brief overview of your philosophical approach and some of the influences that you had as kind of we close out here, because we kind of jumped right into your book, but we want to learn a little bit about you as well. So give us a little background on how you developed your views and what influenced you.
Yes. Okay, I'll try to be very concise. So, born and raised in the United States, just outside of Chicago, and I went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And I was very lucky. I had very supportive parents who, when I said I wanted to go and study in France for my junior year abroad, were 100% behind. So off I went, and then kind of never came back, which I think my father is still like, that wasn't quite what we agreed. Stayed in France for a bit and then moved to the UK and did my graduate work at the London School of Economics for both master's and PhD as an historian looking at France. So France has always been like my laboratory and muse, intellectually and like just probably aesthetically as well. But living in the UK, as I have for 23 years, has definitely shaped me in ways that I'm only now starting to understand. Because when I'm in France or working in French, I'm always very aware that this is not my native culture and it's not my native language. I had to learn how to speak it, and French people will also know that. And I sometimes feel like that explicitness is very helpful. We're all on our guard. Versus here in the UK, because I speak English and because Americans and Brits are so close in so many ways, you can think you're understanding each other. You think you're having the same conversation, and you are not. And I'm sure the amount of times I've put my foot in it is just, shocking. And vice versa, where I've gotten really, quite shocked by something and Brits are like, what? So I just mentioned that to say, I have had a American Anglo-French education and career, and a very Western European career in terms of working with the US and Western Europe, that I'm very aware has many strengths to it, but is also by no means the final world in terms of technology ethics, because technology again is all about all humans, and there are many other philosophical traditions that other people have been working on. Some of them are hinted in my book a bit, but my book really, I think, focuses a lot on the US and the UK. I wanted it to not just be an American book. So if you're looking for some UK case studies, they're there. A bit on China, but as far as I'm concerned, that book is like version 1.0 of my work on technology ethics. And I hope over the course of a hopefully long career, knock wood, to do a lot more global thinking. But that, because of how I was trained, that requires me learning languages, or at least traveling, working, and living in a lot of the places I would want to write about first. So I don't just want to write from an armchair here in London. If I'm going to write about what's happening in Africa or in China, I need to go and do the field work.
That's great. That I think that like broad-based influence really does help,
Mm.
with perspective, right? Because we can look from the lens of our background, which is very, very easy to do. But when you travel and you spend time in other countries, you do see the world a lot differently, and it
Yeah,
helps.
our own
Does help.
country differently too. I mean, it's really helped, I think, give me a different critical perspective on the US. And that doesn't mean to be a critic of the US. I'm very American and I'm very grateful for everything that I have from that country. I just mean that it sometimes helps you to see it with different eyes and to do a lot of benchmarking and comparing and contrasting, which is good. And I guess the goal would be, hopefully over a long life, is to get as many cultures and countries and hopefully languages under your belt, and contacts and friends, just to, so that you're learning and being like, gosh, they're quite good about some stuff in Estonia. We could learn from that. Or China is doing some stuff that's pretty sketchy, but unlike payments, for instance, that could be really interesting. Why does the US still, we seem quite backwards on payments? So just learning that all humans are working on these, a lot of times the same problems and coming up with really different answers to them. Why reinvent the wheel? It used to be so cool to like imagine what the ideal planetary situation looks like, where you're kind of cherry picking, Sweden's this and Germany's this and Peru's this and, Kenya's this. It would be so interesting to see what does that look like.
Yeah, that global collaboration and common problems, and bringing all those perspectives in. So that we see that a lot in some corporations where you have all these people from different countries working together, and those perspectives are really powerful.
So exciting.
It is. This has been a really fun conversation for me. I hope you enjoyed yourself. We explored some topics. There's obviously a lot more we can talk about here, so maybe at some point in the future we can reconnect and go over some of the questions we didn't get to. It was really nice to meet you as well. I'll put a link up to your book on the website, underneath the video or around the video. And then anything else that you can send me some links that you think our readers would like to see as well. So thank you very much, Stephanie. It was really, really great to talk to you, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much for having me. It was such a pleasure.